economy, abortion, the border, issues that matter to you. AZ's On the Fence. Now here's your host, Drew Grunwald.
And welcome to AZ's On the Fence. I'm your host, Drew Grunwald. Joining me on the fence is our state Senator Priya Sundareshan. And you're in Legislative District 18 in Tucson, correct?
That's right. I'm the state senator for District 18.
And now we had due to our census, some redistricting, and I believe that district used to be in the Maricopa County area, and then ended up in Tucson with an open seat. And you were the successful candidate who now represents Tucson.
Yes, just numerically, the numbers all shifted. So 18 may have been up here at one point, but district-wise in Tucson, it was a combination of 9 and 10, which became what's currently District 18.
Fantastic. So you're an incumbent. You've been in office since January of 23. And with 2-year terms, it seems like it doesn't take you very long before you're campaigning again to run again.
Absolutely. That's right. You know, with 2-year terms, there's no difference in the legislature between being in the state Senate or in the state House. So we all run every 2 years. And here we are again. Campaigns are approaching. We've already on the campaign side, every candidate has had to file their signatures. And so the ballot is starting to look set for July.
It is getting there. And for those people listening who aren't familiar with you, I like to ask my guests to give us their elevator pitch, right? In a 30-second elevator ride, what do you want people to know about you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm born and raised in Tucson, so I'm so thrilled to be able to represent the city and the district that is the area in which I was born and raised and grew up. I went to public schools in my district. Catalina Foothills is my school district, and I'm also I'm an engineer by training, so science and math and data-driven decision-making is something that I'm really passionate about. I also went to law school at the University of Arizona, in particular driven by environmental law. And so that's something that I, after law school, pursued environmental law, energy law, and I became an environmental advocate. And so making sure that Arizona is sustainable for future generations to come, using that sustainability principles through our water use and addressing climate change. All of those things are important to me. I've got 2 small children, so I want to make sure Arizona continues to be a great place for them to grow up in.
Great. And I know on your platform, renewable energy is one of your big topics, one of your big items, something you care a lot about. What do you think Arizona can do to help further renewable energy? Our state is different than many other states. What is it that Arizona can do to help move renewable energy forward?
Well, I think the obvious answer is taking advantage of our solar resources. You know, we get so much sunlight in Arizona, and what I don't see reflecting that is the fact is the number of rooftops that are across Arizona that don't have solar panels on them. And I think that's something that's a missed opportunity. We should be covering every rooftop with solar panels, and that's not something that's on the individual person to be able to put up front the costs of putting solar on their house. I think the state needs to be providing resources. I think our utilities should be providing resources and encouraging and incentivizing that kind of solar panel adoption. We haven't seen those policies yet, and that's what I'd like to change.
You know, and I have to agree on the respect. I love when I pull into a parking lot, Bash's, Fry's, whatever, and the covered parking are solar panels. I think it's brilliant. I get a shady spot to park, and we've got great acreage for solar panels. We need more.
That's right. There's so many benefits that come from either putting solar panels on your rooftops or incorporating into your parking spaces, the shade principle that applies. You can even extrapolate that to farms. There's some areas of research on agrivoltaics that are showing that crops even can grow better in Arizona and use less water if they're shaded by solar panels, and it improves the solar production. I think that's an area we should be looking at more, but there's so much we could be doing and pursuing. So that's where one of my main focuses is.
Fascinating. I hadn't even thought that. Yeah, the plants in the summertime sometimes our sunlight will fry them. So why not grow them in the shade? They still get plenty of sunlight and get the solar as well. Fantastic idea. What else? How's our water? I've heard people say Arizona has plenty of water, and then I've heard people say we don't. Where are we at with water?
Well, we might have plenty of water if we properly manage it. And that's, I think, what we're currently trying to figure out. Are we managing our water resources, or are we simply, in many parts of the state, we have no regulations on water use. And so it's simply whoever can drill the deepest well gets to access the water, and they might dry up the wells of nearby residents, people who've lived there for generations. We're starting to see those stories. And that's something that we need to be protecting against in our rural areas. And, our cities have been managing their water under the 1980 Groundwater Management Act for decades. There's definitely improvements that need to be made there to make sure that we're able to continue growing our cities, but growing them wisely and in a way that, density, and dense development, growing in areas that aren't kind of, depending on unsustainable groundwater use.
Sure. I know it's expensive, but reclaimed water is an excellent use for large open spaces, parks, golf courses, those types of things. I don't know what other sources we could use reclaimed water for, but the more we can use reclaimed water for things other than drinking water seems to make a lot of sense.
It's a question of both. Reclaimed water is currently in use in air. If you look at Tucson, we've got an excellent reclaimed water pipe system that pipes water directly to some of those outdoor uses. There's plenty more that can be done, I think, in that space where you can treat the water even further if you need to get more drinking water. But it is as the city of Tucson does really well, they look at it from a holistic one water perspective, and recognizing that the portfolio of water comes from a lot of different sources.
Oh, that's great to hear. I know a lot of states get plenty of rain and they don't need to even worry about it. But here in the desert, obviously water is something it's a valuable resource and we don't want to waste it.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting ready to run for a second term. Let's hear from you. What is it in your first term so far that you've done that you're very proud of? And what do you think you're going to be focusing on your second term?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my first term, I've been very proud to be using my experience and expertise on natural resources issues and environmental issues to be ranking member on the Senate Natural Resources Committee and influencing some of the bills and the discussions that we're having in that space. I'm also really proud to have been ranking member on the Senate Elections Committee. I do have a background in voter protection and certainly a passion for making sure that we are increasing access to voting and not limiting people's ability to cast their ballot. And so what I've been really proud of is this year, the governor signed the very first bill of the session was a fix to some of our elections deadlines that was threatening to become a real crisis, because if we weren't able to fix some of these deadlines, there's the potential that Arizona wouldn't be able to submit our electoral college results to the electoral college in time for Arizona's presidential votes to matter. And so this was a really important negotiation that occurred between the Republican majority and the Democratic legislators and, of course, the governor's office. And we were able to come together with a bipartisan elections bill that fixed the deadlines issue, that didn't add any burdens to voters, and that ultimately should help make our elections stronger. That's something that I see often in the elections committee is, there's a lot of talk out in the public about elections fraud or problems with elections. A lot of that's not really based in facts. Our elections are actually very well run. We have very strong, secure elections. We have paper ballots. We have a month-long voting time frame, and in our counties, the voting center model actually is really good about allowing people to vote at the time and place of their choosing. Not to mention, of course, we also over 80% of Arizonans vote by mail. And that's another important way that we are able to make voting easy and flexible while also keeping the security protocols in place. And so what I think I want Arizonans to know is our voting systems are strong and secure, and any fixes that need to happen are generally small, but always need to be done keeping the voters in mind and making sure that voters can be confident that their votes will count.
Obviously, but voting is important. It's one of our rights as U.S. citizens, and votes matter, right? They have consequences. So make sure you get out and vote. So if you win your second term, what are you going to focus on going forward?
Yeah, well, in my second term, I will continue to focus on environmental issues, both the water. I'm certain our water issues will continue needing to be addressed. We have a lot of important water issues that come up. Right now, there's a lot of negotiations over whether or not we will reach agreement on protecting rural groundwater, which, as I mentioned earlier, is currently completely unregulated. But so if that doesn't come together this year, in my second term, I want to be able to continue that discussion and make sure that we are protecting rural groundwater for Arizonans. There's also, again, in the cities, we also have some things that I'd like to do to make our protections for our water even more secure, make sure that our assured water supply program is really strong. So that's the water space. With renewable energy, I want to keep pushing for making sure that we are encouraging regular people and utilities to work together and put solar panels up on as many rooftops as possible and incorporate that as a much larger part of our energy portfolio. And in the voting space, I think there's a lot to do in terms of making sure that our laws are the right ones, but certainly keeping our elections officials with the resources that they need to be able to continue putting together the elections in the safe and secure manner that they do, supporting our elections officials with resources, increasing protections for our elections workers, our poll workers, people who have been, and especially recently, are getting intimidated by people who are harassing them in some cases because they are think that there is fraud going on and that the election workers are to blame. And I think the last thing maybe there is making sure that we're also staying ahead of emerging issues. There may be some issues in elections with the use of deep fake technology and putting in place some strong safeguards to make sure that our candidates aren't worried that people might be out there making videos and content that aren't what they say.
Right. Well, that's fantastic information. What I'd like to do is have you stay on with another segment. We just had a very important vote here in Arizona about abortion, and I would love to get your feedback on that. So please join me after the break. If you're listening to AZ's On the Fence, download us wherever you get your favorite podcast. We'll be right back. Thinking about selling your home but unsure about the current market and the value of your home? Call the experts at A2 Luxury Real Estate. The team has over 50 years experience in real estate, appraisal, and finance. Having the right team with the right experience will help you make the right decision when it comes to selling your home. The pinnacle of luxury real estate starts with A2 Luxury Real Estate. Visit us at a2luxre.com or call 602-888-1433, Realty One Group. And welcome back to AZ's On the Fence. I'm your host, Drew Grunwald, and joining me this segment is Arizona State Senator Priya Sundareshan, Legislative District 18 for Tucson. In the last segment, we talked about your first term and what you've accomplished. Renewable energy, running again for a second term is right around the corner, and we're getting close. We're about 180 days from that vote. Are you ready?
Yes.
What more would you or could you do to be more prepared for that very important election coming up in November?
Well, I think most of us here in the legislature are waiting until the end of the legislative session in order to be able to turn fully to our campaign mode. So that would be the thing that we are looking forward to. Right now, we're still in session, so we're still negotiating bills, and the budget is still outstanding. And of course, we had a huge vote on Wednesday.
Yes, I was just going to get to that. We on Wednesday, just a few days ago, we had a huge vote, and give us a little background. And I'm sure being an elected representative, it was very important. You took it seriously, and let's talk about Arizona and how old that old law was, and what was put forward and what was just voted on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the backdrop, the context is that we had this statute on the books since 1864 that was a total ban on abortions. And not only that, it criminalized anyone who assisted in getting an abortion, to include doctors, nurses, any health provider, could even include someone who drove the patient to get the abortion, right? There's so much that was very cruel and all-encompassing in this very archaic and draconian ban. And for the longest time, we had this statute on the books, but it didn't really matter in Arizona because we had the federal protections of the U.S. Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. But in 2022, that federal protection went away when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade decision in their Dobbs decision. And so what happened was now we no longer had that federal protections, and most state laws that were in place could potentially come into effect. And there were lawsuits since that decision that were asking the Arizona Supreme Court to decide, is that 1864 ban still valid, or are we looking to more recent abortion bans like the one that was passed in 2022 that was a 15-week abortion ban. Now the problem, and this is what the Arizona Supreme Court read, and they read the literal law that was passed in 2022, that when they passed it, said we keep the 1864 law in effect. And so they were saying we specifically are not overturning the 1864 law in passing this 15-week ban. So the Arizona Supreme Court's decision pointed to that and said, yes, looks like the legislature meant to keep that 1864 ban alive when they passed this more recent law. That kicked off, that was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was horrific. Everyone was starting to realize, what does this actually mean? If this ban is going to come into effect, it's going to be so dramatically terrible. There are no exceptions in this ban for if someone needs an abortion for any reason other than the life of the patient, right? Which even that in itself is such a hard exception to prove, because doctors are reporting right now in other states and even here, how far do you have to let the person go towards death to be able to prove that they're really about to die before you give them the abortion? And at that point, how much else is ruined about their health and their body, what's the quality of life after that, right? So it's really tough. And everyone in Arizona, we could tell by the reactions, was horrified that this was potentially going to be the law of the land. And the vast majority of Arizonans don't want this. And so Democrats tried immediately the next day after that Supreme Court decision was handed down. Democrats in the legislature on both the House side and the Senate side tried to bring forward bills to immediately repeal that law. We were unsuccessful. We weren't able to get the Republicans to support that. Finally, the week after that, we were able to start that process on the Senate side. And in the House side, they did finally, bring that bill. But it was the whole time it was Democrats making the motions to bring the repeal bills forward. And finally, fortunately, in both the House side and the Senate side, we brought those bills forward. We got maybe two or three Republicans in each house to join with us, with the rest of the entire Democratic caucus, to be able to repeal this law. And so now both houses voted on it. Today it went to the governor, and the governor signed that repeal into law. So that law will no longer be on the books. There is a question of when that goes into effect and whether the 1864 ban still has a chance of going into effect before the repeal operates. But hopefully, I know there are some potential requests for the courts to stay the effectiveness of that ban because we have already repealed it. We don't intend for that ban to continue.
Right. I mean,
so that's where we are.
There's plenty of laws on the books that our legislators, our lawmakers, and our police, they just choose not to enforce them. So this may be the case, right? If something does happen, they just won't enforce anything, knowing that the new law is coming into effect.
That's true. And certainly, our governor and our attorney general have done everything that they can in order to make sure that this law won't be enforced. There's the case. I mean, but it's true that across Arizona, we have different jurisdictions, and we have different people in charge of different, the different county attorneys may feel differently about whether or not they would like to enforce the law. Maybe the sheriffs do. Thankfully, the attorney general and the governor signed an executive order giving the attorney general that authority. But you never know if there's a county attorney that wants to test it and wants to enforce the law regardless. So it still could be a precarious situation for a pregnant person.
And let's hope not. I mean, you never want to put, someone's life in jeopardy like that. And they're just trying to do what they think is best for them. And you have to, your heart goes out to people who are making a tough decision. So
absolutely. And I mentioned a little earlier, I have two small children. So I've gone through pregnancy pretty recently, as recently, in fact, as when some of those 2022 laws were being voted into law. And I was starting to get worried about what happens if I'm going through my pregnancy and I suddenly find some kind of issue with the pregnancy that makes abortion an option or a kind of a necessary option for me. And I was starting to get worried as to whether I would be able to see the pregnancy through. So you really, even though you might personally not want to have to go through an abortion, you never know when you might need one. And I think that having that option and the ability to have that conversation between the patient and the provider without government interfering is the key thing
options,
to keep in
for
mind.
Sure. That's important. One of the questions that's a hot topic, and I like to ask my guests, is our border. I would love to know. You're in Tucson, and you're kind of you're closer than the Phoenix area is. I mean, you represent the Tucson area, and it would be very interesting, to know maybe where you're at with the border, and is there anything? What are the plans? What are we going to do to fix our border? Because it does seem to be an issue. Something has to be done. I don't think it can stay the way it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Tucson certainly is close to the border, so we see a lot of what is the fact and what is the fiction that's being put out there into the general media about that. And so, from my Tucson perspective, we're certainly facing the humanitarian implications of seeing a lot of people coming across the border because they're seeking asylum, because they're fleeing some terrible situation in their own home countries. We know there are plenty of gang violence and other types of corrupt situations in a lot of these countries, that people are fleeing to the United States for safety and taking what steps that they need to do in order to come across the border. They're traveling many, many hundreds of miles across the desert in terrifying conditions without many resources. So in Tucson, what we've seen is the humanitarian issue of how do we receive the people who are coming across the border and not, have them simply sleep, trying to sleep on the streets. So what we've got a great system in Tucson of organizations that have come together to provide that kind of support. And the federal government, thankfully, just did approve an influx of money to support that, because we would really be hurting if we didn't have that. Of course, the broader question is why are we kind of creating this situation that both creates the humanitarian crisis and also makes it so difficult to cross, makes it so that we have pushed a lot of the migration out from the ports of entry, but to outside and to these dangerous areas, and the over militarization aspect. I will say that the federal government had the chance, Congress had a deal in front of them with the Biden administration where they had been offered, congressional Republicans specifically, who are pushing for much stricter enforcement and kind of that kind of military, I think, response. They had a deal in front of them that actually granted them a lot of what they were seeking. And yet then they turned away from it because, congressional Republicans specifically turned away from that deal because they heard from former President Trump that he actually wanted to keep the border alive as a campaign issue. And so unfortunately, even though we hear a lot from folks about wanting to see much more of a stronger enforcement presence at the border, even when given the opportunity, they didn't actually take it.
Given the opportunity, if the goal is to fix things, people need to start reaching across the aisles. And good luck in your campaign and in the vote in November. And we certainly appreciate your time today. You've been listening to AZ's On the Fence. Be sure to download us anywhere you listen to your favorite podcast, or go to Arizona Decides 2024. Now get off the fence and go vote.